The star was dying by degrees the way stars never actually died, not in the catastrophic, cinematic collapse that made for good holoprojector drama back in the inner sphere, but in the slow, grinding furnace work of hydrogen fusion that had been running since before the first human ancestor looked up and wondered. From inside the ICS Iron's Hard S bridge viewport, it filled a third of the visible sky, close enough that the hull's thermal plating was doing serious work, close enough that Star Captain Reva Okafor could see the chromospheric convection cells churning on its surface like slow boiling water the size of continents. It was, she had decided in the 47 minutes since their emergence from whatever had happened to them, the most beautiful and most terrifying thing she had ever seen. The second most terrifying thing was the ship. It had been there when they arrived, when the quantum fold or dimensional rupture or whatever the Snow Raven physicists were going to eventually call it had deposited the Iron's Heart into a star system that existed on no chart in any database she carried. Ancient was the word that came to mind looking at it, not as a descriptor of age but as a category of presence. The vessel was enormous, asymmetrical in the way that things became asymmetrical after millions of years of repair and damage and repair again, trailing structures that might have been weapons or sensors or simply the accumulated scars of incomprehensible time. It was holding position in the star's corona, which should have been impossible, which meant whoever had built it had solved problems that the inner sphere's best aerospace engineers hadn't yet correctly identified as problems. The Iron's Heart was not holding position so much as struggling to maintain one. Force Commander Danny Rourke had the damage report in her hand and was reading it with the expression she reserved for things that were bad but survivable, which Okafor had learned to distinguish from Rourke's expression for things that were bad and probably not survivable. Primary drive was offline. Secondary maneuvering thrusters were at 40%. The quantum fold, the event, whatever it was, had sheared 3 of the 4 primary drive nodes clean off their mounting pylons. They were, in the most precise navigational sense of the term, adrift. Functional, armed, and adrift. Reactor status, Okafor said. Ship reactor at 62% efficiency, said tech specialist Amara Kess, not looking up from her console. Drive damage affected 2 of the cooling loops. We can sustain current output indefinitely, but we cannot increase it without risking a cascade failure. A pause. Mech reactors are all nominal. Whatever the fold did, it didn't touch the bay. Small mercies. Okafor noted it without comfort. The other ship is moving, said Navigator Penn, and every head on the bridge turned to the sensor display simultaneously. It was subtle. The ancient vessel had shifted its corona skimming trajectory by perhaps 3 degrees, a reorientation that was nonetheless unambiguous in its meaning. It had seen them. It was looking at them now the way you looked at something you hadn't decided about yet, which Okafor recognized as the same way she was looking at it. Weapons? Rourke asked. If it has any, they're not hot. No targeting emissions. No active fire control. Sensor Tech Briggs pulled at the display, expanding the resolution. I'm reading life signs aboard. Human biosignatures, hundreds of them. And Colonel, the power signature on that ship is like nothing in our database. Not fusion. Not fission. Something older. Rourke set down the damage report. She was a broad-shouldered woman from New Avalon. 29 years of AFS service written in the set of her jaw and the way she stood with her weight slightly forward, always ready to move. She looked at Okafor the way she always looked at her in moments of genuine uncertainty, not deferring, never that. They had fought too many proxy political battles for either of them to pretend the inner sphere/clan tension between them had fully resolved. But genuinely consulting. 2 commanders who had learned, slowly and badly, to think together. We answer, Okafor said, which was what she had said in every version of this moment across her career. It was clan doctrine, and it was simply true. You did not hide from the unknown. The unknown found you anyway, and it respected you less for having hidden. Agreed. Rourke turned to the communication station. All frequencies. And Petrov. Use the old standard English broadcasts, pre-drift dialect if you can manage it. We don't know how far we are from anything familiar. Petrov nodded and began transmitting. Aboard Destiny, the moment began the way most moments of genuine crisis began for Colonel Everett Young, with an alarm he didn't fully understand going off at a time when he was already dealing with 3 other things he didn't fully understand. The ship had been charging in the star's corona for 6 hours, standard procedure now. The crew adapted to the routine of sheltering from the heat in the cooler interior sections while Destiny fed. He'd been in the middle of a supply review with James when the alert came through, and he made it to the control interface room in under 2 minutes, which for a man whose left knee had been giving him trouble since the Nakai boarding action was faster than it should have been. Rush was already there. Rush was always already there, which Young had long since stopped finding suspicious and started finding simply inevitable. Like bad weather. "Talk to me," Young said. "A vessel emerged from a spatial fold approximately 14 minutes ago," Rush said without looking up from his console, his accent thickening the way it did when he was focused on something that genuinely interested him rather than simply intrigued him. "The fold itself is the remarkable thing. It's not a hyperspace window, it's not a wormhole in any configuration I recognize. The energy signature matches something I've seen in Destiny's own ancient records." He paused, precisely long enough to make Young aware the pause was deliberate. "Siege ship emergence protocols. The kind used for long-range personnel recovery. Someone used an ancient siege ship protocol to arrive here. Someone triggered one. Whether they did it intentionally is a separate question." Rush finally looked up. "The vessel is human-manufactured, Colonel. Hull alloys, structural geometry, mechanical drive systems. Someone built that ship with their hands and their mathematics and their understanding of physics as it existed up to a point roughly 3 centuries ahead of where Earth was when we left it." Young stared at the display. The Iron's Heart sat on the sensor screen, battered and asymmetrical, radiating heat from a dozen independent power sources. "They're from Earth? They're from humanity," Rush said. "Which is not necessarily the same thing." Eli Wallace appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, hair doing the thing it did when he'd been running. He looked at the display, then at Rush, then at Young, then back at the display. "Okay," he said, slightly breathless. "So that's a dropship. From BattleTech. Like, that is a Union-class dropship. I am not even slightly joking right now. I had the technical manual when I was 14. "Eli," Young said. "Right, yes, focusing. They're transmitting. Old English, like, really old, like 300 years evolved old, but I can read it." He looked up from his tablet with an expression that was equal parts terror and the particular electric joy he could never quite suppress when the universe did something impossible. "Colonel, they're asking if we need assistance." Young looked at the ship on the display. Looked at the damage scoring on its hull. Looked at the power readings that suggested whoever was aboard had fusion reactors running in their cargo bay. Multiple of them, independent, hot. "Tell them," he said slowly, "that we appreciate the offer. And ask them what they need. If you want to see more factions enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a faction and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below." Indeed. The translation problem was worse than Eli had initially suggested, which was saying something because his initial suggestion had included the phrase, "Like trying to read Shakespeare if Shakespeare had also invented 40 new words for weapons malfunction." 300 years of linguistic drift had done to English what 300 years of anything did to a living system. Mutated it, compressed it, expanded it in directions nobody had planned, grafted technical vocabulary onto emotional registers and emotional vocabulary onto technical ones until the resulting dialect was simultaneously recognizable and deeply, consistently wrong in ways that were harder to navigate than outright difference would have been. He'd been at it for 2 hours by the time the Iron's Heart's commander agreed to a face-to-face communication via the ancient long-range visual interface that Destiny used for its stone-based Earth contact. The visual link was imperfect, a slight temporal lag, compression artifacts at the edges of the frame, but it was enough to see faces, and Eli had learned aboard Destiny that seeing faces mattered more than people who'd grown up with reliable communication technology ever appreciated. Star Captain Reva Okafor appeared on the screen with the posture of someone who had decided, before the connection opened, exactly how much of herself she was going to reveal and exactly how much she was going to hold back. She was perhaps 40, dark-skinned, with close-cropped hair and the particular stillness of someone whose profession required her to make life-or-death decisions quickly enough that she'd stopped wasting energy on the small movements most people made unconsciously. Behind her, partially visible, was a larger woman with the look of someone who'd been in uniform so long the uniform had become structural rather than cosmetic. Young stood at Eli's shoulder. Rush stood slightly apart, which was his version of being present while maintaining deniability. "I am Star Captain Reva Okafor," the woman said, "of Clan Snow Raven. The vessel is ICS Iron's Heart. We carry 143 personnel and—" A fractional pause that Eli clocked as deliberate. "Operational equipment." Eli translated the slightly archaic phrasing for young in a low murmur. She said operational equipment instead of weapons or BattleMechs, which in the technical manuals usually means she's not lying but she's definitely curating. "Noted," Young said quietly. Then, to the screen. "Colonel Everett Young, commanding officer of the vessel Destiny. We're glad you're safe, Star Captain. Your ship sustained damage in the transit. We detected it on our sensors. What do you need?" The pause before Okafor answered was not a translation pause. It was a pride pause. Eli recognized it because he'd seen the same pause in Ronan decks when Ronan had been new to Atlantis, and hadn't yet learned that asking for help aboard a friendly vessel wasn't a surrender. "Our primary drive is non-functional," Okafor said. "We cannot achieve standard transit under our own power. Our reactor is operating at reduced efficiency. Our food stores are—" Another fractional hesitation. "Adequate for approximately 22 days at current consumption." 22 days, Young repeated. "Affirmative." Young looked at Eli. Eli looked back with an expression that said, "Yes, I know, I'm doing the math too." Behind Okafor, the larger woman stepped forward slightly and spoke, a different voice, broader vowels, the English less drifted, closer to something Young might have spoken himself in a slightly different world. "Force Commander Danny Rourke, Seti Hussars, Armed Forces of the Federated Suns. Colonel Young, I want to be straight with you because I think we're past the point where anything but straight talk serves either of us. We don't know where we are. Our navigators have been running stellar cartography for 2 hours and nothing matches. We triggered something we didn't understand and it moved us somewhere we can't identify, and we cannot go home under our own power. A beat. What I need to know, before anything else, is whether you can." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a truth that everyone in the room already knew but nobody had yet said aloud. Young let it breathe for exactly as long as it needed to. "No," he said. "We can't go home either." The reaction aboard the Iron's Heart to this information, conveyed in full by Okafor and Rourke to their assembled senior staff in the dropship's cramped briefing room, was instructive in ways that Eli would later try to explain to Chloe, and mostly fail. The Inner Sphere personnel, the AFS soldiers and technicians, took it the way soldiers took bad news that they'd already half suspected. A settling of weight, a tightening around the eyes, the particular stillness of people reorganizing their interior architecture around a new load-bearing fact. There was grief in it, quick and suppressed, the way professional military grief always was. The Clan Snow Raven personnel took it differently. Not better, not worse, differently. They went very still in a way that suggested not suppression but assessment, the way a predator went still when the terrain shifted unexpectedly. Eli, watching through the visual link that Okafor had agreed to leave open during the crew briefing, had the distinct impression that the Snow Ravens were running tactical calculations rather than emotional ones, and that the tactical calculations were not producing panic. The youngest MechWarrior in the room, barely 20, with the look of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide what he was feeling, raised his hand. In the inner sphere/clan hybrid protocol that Eli was beginning to map, this was apparently acceptable in informal briefings. Star Captain. If we cannot return, what is our mission? Okafor looked at him steadily. Survival. Then contribution. Then, if the opportunity presents itself, return. She said it the way someone said something they'd already worked out before they needed to say it. We are Snow Raven and Hussars. We have operated in the deep periphery on 6-month deployments with no HPG contact and hostile contact weekly. This is longer and farther. The principles do not change. Rourke added, from her side of the briefing room. And the people on that ship out there are in the same situation we are. Which means we have something in common worth more than any treaty or alliance document. We're all we've got. Eli relayed this to Young. Young listened, then was quiet for a moment. Ask them, he said finally, if they're willing to come aboard for a joint briefing. Full crew introduction, both sides. No weapons beyond standard sidearms. He paused. And tell them we'll figure out the food situation. We always do. How? Eli asked, because he was the one who would have to believe it enough to translate it convincingly. Young gave him the look, the one that wasn't quite confidence, and wasn't quite resignation but existed in the functional space between them where command decisions actually lived. Same way we always do. One problem at a time. Rush had said nothing for the duration of the communication. He stood at his console now, after the channel had closed, pulling up Destiny's internal schematics on a secondary display with the focused quiet that meant he was thinking about something he hadn't shared yet. Eli watched him from across the room. Rush. The Siege Ship Protocol, Rush said without turning. It activated in response to their vessel. To their specific energy signature. He pulled up a data string, ancient characters cascading down the screen. Destiny's been in this region of space before, millions of years ago, on its original pass. The siege ship it deployed here left a beacon. He finally turned, and his expression was the one Eli had learned to be most cautious about. Not the scheming one, not the dismissive one, but the one that looked almost like wonder. It was calibrated to respond to fusion energy output within a specific range. A range that matches a human-scale fusion reactor running at military-grade output. A pause. Not an ancient reactor. Not a gold Naquata plant. A baseline human fusion reactor of a type that Destiny's builders apparently knew, millions of years ago, that humanity would eventually develop. Eli stared at him. You're saying the ancients knew they were coming. I'm saying, Rush said carefully, that something did. The logistics of bringing 143 additional people aboard a ship already running on rationed air, recycled water, and collective willpower required the kind of mathematics that made Camille Ray's expression do things Eli had never seen it do before. She sat at the mess table with her tablet and her notepad. She still used a notepad, physical paper, which aboard Destiny had become a minor luxury. And ran the numbers 3 times because the first 2 times produced results she didn't want to present to Young without verification. The 3rd time produced the same results. At current consumption rates, she said in the measured tone she used when the news was bad enough that measured was the only responsible delivery mechanism. Adding 143 personnel to Destiny's life support load reduces our sustainability window from approximately 4 months to approximately 6 weeks. That's before accounting for their food stores, which at 22 days gives us a combined buffer of. She checked the notepad. Not enough. Young sat across from her with his hands flat on the table. It was his thinking posture, Eli had noticed, the physical equivalent of planting himself. What do we need? We need a planet with edible biomass within the next 3 weeks. We need the water reclamation system to run at 100%. Which it hasn't done since the Nakai boarding damaged the secondary filtration coupling. And we need everyone on both crews to understand that rationing isn't a temporary inconvenience. It's the operational baseline until further notice. I'll talk to Rourke and Okafor. There's something else. Ray set down the tablet. Colonel, 143 people changes our social dynamics as significantly as our resource dynamics. Destiny's crew has spent months developing equilibrium. Fragile equilibrium, but equilibrium. These people come from a civilization where warfare between human factions is essentially constant. They have internal tensions of their own. Inner sphere and clan personnel don't have a comfortable history. We're not just adding bodies. We're adding fault lines. Young looked at her for a moment. You think they're a security risk. I think they're people, Ray said. Which means yes, under sufficient pressure, they're a security risk. So are we. The first shuttle transfer brought Okafor, Rourke, and 6 of their senior staff across to Destiny in 2 trips, the Iron's Hard-S atmospheric shuttle threading carefully through the narrow docking approach that Destiny's automated systems had reluctantly opened. Eli watched from the docking bay corridor as the hatch cycled, genuinely uncertain what he was about to see, his brain still partially stuck in the 14-year-old version of himself who'd had the technical manuals. What came through the hatch first was Rourke, which made immediate sense. She was AFS, she understood military protocol, she knew you sent the person most likely to be read as non-threatening first in an unknown environment. She was carrying a sidearm holstered and visible, as agreed, and she looked at Destiny's docking bay with the expression of a woman who had walked into a lot of unfamiliar spaces in her career and developed a reliable method for processing them. Slow scan, structural assessment, exit identification, threat evaluation, then and only then the human element. Her eyes found Young first. Military recognition, the involuntary identification of the ranking officer in a room that happened the same way in any century and apparently any civilization. Colonel Young, she said, extending a hand. Force Commander Rourke. Thank you for the berth. Glad to have you, Young said, which was the thing you said, and shook her hand with the particular firmness that meant he was also assessing, also running his own version of her scan. Okafor came through second, and the difference was immediately legible. Where Rourke had scanned the room practically, Okafor scanned it the way someone scanned a system before committing to an engagement, not looking for exits but looking for geometry, angles, the invisible tactical topology of the space. She was shorter than Rourke by several inches and somehow occupied more of the room, the specific presence of someone whose authority didn't come from size or volume but from the quality of their attention. She looked at Destiny's docking bay, the ancient architecture, the worn surfaces, the evidence of repair layered over repair layered over repair over millions of years. And something moved through her expression that wasn't quite awe and wasn't quite calculation but sat precisely between them. This ship, she said to no one in particular, is very old. Yeah, Eli said from his position slightly behind Young's left shoulder. That's basically the summary. She looked at him. He had the distinct impression of being assessed at a level of detail that was slightly uncomfortable. You are the one who translated, she said. Eli Wallace. I do a lot of things. Translator is one of them currently. You translated accurately, she said, which in the inflection she used was apparently a significant compliment. The joint briefing happened in Destiny's largest common space, which was not very large. Both crews filled it past comfortable capacity, the BattleTech personnel having transferred across in groups throughout the afternoon watch, and the resulting density of bodies in a room with Destiny's standard atmospheric recycling created a humidity and temperature that made everyone slightly irritable, which Eli noted was probably not ideal for a first impression diplomatic moment, but was thoroughly on brand for Destiny. Young stood at the front and gave the version of the speech he'd given variants of before, where they were, why they couldn't go home, how the ship worked in broad strokes, what the threats were. He was economical about it, the way he was economical about everything that cost him something emotionally, and Eli watched Okafor and Rourke listening with the attention of people who were storing everything for later analysis rather than reacting in the moment. When Young finished, Rourke asked the question Eli had been expecting. What are the primary threats we should know about? Alien vessels, we call them Nakai, have been tracking and periodically attacking Destiny for the duration of our mission. They're interested in the ship's data and in capturing crew members for interrogation." Young paused. "There are also automated weapons platforms, berserker drones, that we've encountered in certain regions. And the ship itself presents hazards. Sections that haven't been opened in millions of years. Systems that activate without warning. Ancient technology that we don't fully understand and that doesn't always respond predictably." "The Nakai," Okafor said. "They're vessels." "What class?" "We don't have an equivalent classification system to yours. They're faster than Destiny in open space. They use energy weapons, and they deployed boarding craft." Okafor absorbed this. "Have you engaged them in close-quarters combat?" "Several times." "Outcome?" "We're still here," Young said. The Snow Raven MechWarriors exchanged looks that Eli was beginning to learn how to read, a rapid nonverbal conversation conducted in the micro-expressions of people who trained together long enough that language had become redundant for certain categories of information. The exchange lasted perhaps 2 seconds and concluded with a collective settling of posture that looked like professional interests being filed away for later deployment. Then Rush spoke, from the back of the room, which was his preferred position for moments when he wanted maximum information and minimum visibility. "Star Captain Okafor, I'd like to discuss your vessel's power systems. Specifically the independent fusion reactors in the mech bay." Every BattleTech head in the room turned toward him with the specific quality of attention that military personnel gave to someone who had just reached for something they hadn't been invited to touch. "Would you?" Okafor said. It was not a question. "The reactors are running at significant output relative to Destiny's current power reserves," Rush continued, with the tone of someone laying out a logical argument who was aware the logic might not be the only relevant factor but was proceeding anyway. "Integration, even partial, even temporary, could substantially extend our operational capacity and address several life support constraints that are currently Dr. Rush," Rourke said pleasantly. "Those reactors are inside our BattleMechs. The BattleMechs are our operational equipment. You are describing, in fairly direct terms, access to our weapons systems. I'm describing a power-sharing arrangement that benefits everyone aboard this ship." "You're describing it," Okafor said quietly. "We have not agreed to discuss it." Her eyes moved from Rush to Young. "Colonel, is this your approach to resource negotiation?" Young gave Rush a look that covered a significant amount of ground efficiently. "It's Dr. Rush's approach," he said, "which he undertook without my authorization. I apologize." He said the last 2 words with the weariness of a man who had said them about Rush before, expected to say them again, and had made a kind of peace with the pattern. "We have legitimate resource concerns that we'd like to discuss with you formally, at a time and in a manner that respects your command authority over your own equipment. That's the conversation I want to have." Okafor studied him for a long moment. Then something shifted, fractionally, in the set of her shoulders. "That," she said, "is the conversation we will have." Rush, in the back of the room, said nothing. But Eli saw him make a small note on his tablet, and knew that Rush's version of the conversation had simply been moved to a different venue. The BattleMech came aboard Destiny in pieces. This had been Rourke's compromise. Not the machine intact and operational, which Young's security instinct wouldn't permit in Destiny's corridors, but disassembled to the torso and leg sections that the Iron's Hard S shuttle could physically transfer, then reassembled in the largest interior bay Destiny had, which turned out to be a cavernous storage section 3 decks below the gate room that nobody had fully explored because the lighting had never worked properly, and the door had required Eli 40 minutes of ancient interface work to open. The mech was a catapult, inner sphere design, AFS markings, missile-heavy configuration. Its pilot, a compact and precise man named Warrant Officer Finadissa, oversaw the reassembly with the focused anxiety of someone watching strangers handle something irreplaceable. Which was exactly what he was doing. McKay arrived uninvited, which was his standard arrival method. The reactor on this thing, he said, appearing at Eli's shoulder and staring upward at the catapult's torso section being lowered into position by the Iron's Hard's portable crane system. It's a compact fusion plant running at what, 250 megawatts? 280 sustained, Odessa said without looking at him. 310 peak. McKay made a sound that in a less controlled person would have been a whimper. 310 peak. From something that fits inside a 20-meter bipedal chassis. He pulled out his tablet. Earth's best compact fusion design in 2009 was producing 40 megawatts in a package 4 times the size. How? Improved magnetic confinement geometry, Odessa said. Better understanding of plasma instability at the boundary layer. 3 centuries of iterative engineering. 3 centuries of... McKay stopped. Started again. You're telling me humanity solved compact fusion and nobody told us? You were not there to tell, Odessa said with a simplicity that landed harder than argument would have. McKay was quiet for approximately 4 seconds, which was unusual enough that Eli noted it. Then, I need to see the confinement geometry schematics. No, said Odessa. I'm not going to steal anything, I just... No, said Odessa, with the patient finality of someone who had been told what was and wasn't his to share and had no internal conflict about the boundary. McKay looked at Eli. Eli shrugged sympathetically. McKay looked back at the catapult with the expression of a man in the presence of something extraordinary that he was not allowed to touch, which Eli privately thought was probably good for McKay's character development. The catapult was fully assembled by the end of the watch cycle, standing in the storage bay with its missile racks empty and its reactor idling at minimum output, and the quality of light it cast. The faint heat shimmer of a fusion plant doing passive work made the ancient bay look simultaneously older and more alive. Rourke stood before it with Okafor, both of them looking up at the machine with the particular expression of commanders contemplating an asset in an unfamiliar context. 1 mech, Young said, joining them. In a cleared bay, reactor at idle, pilot on standby only. That was the agreement. And we've honored it, Rourke said. I know. I'm not. Young stopped, recalibrated. I'm telling you I know, and I appreciate it. Rourke looked at him sideways. You're not used to saying that. Not as often as I should be. It was the most candid thing he'd said to either of them since their arrival, and Eli, standing near the bay entrance pretending to review his tablet, watched both BattleTech commanders register it and quietly recalibrate their assessment of Young in response. Okafor turned from the mech. Colonel. You're Dr. Rush. He approached me privately this morning. Young's jaw tightened, barely perceptible. What did he say? He proposed an information exchange. Snow Raven analytical methodology applied to certain sections of this ship's engineering that he has been unable to access. In return, he offered data on Destiny's mission that he suggested you had not fully shared with your crew. She watched Young's face carefully. I did not agree. I told him any arrangement required your authorization. I am telling you now because... A fractional pause. I think he should know what kind of man you are commanding with. The silence that followed had texture. Young nodded once slowly. I know exactly what kind of man he is, he said. Thank you for telling me anyway. The catapult had been aboard for 6 hours when the alert sounded. Nakai vessels. 3 of them, emerging from their fold space approach at the outer edge of sensor range, moving on an intercept vector with the particular unhurried confidence of a predator that had learned its prey's maximum speed and was in no hurry. Destiny's crew moved to stations with the practiced urgency of people who had done this before and survived, which was its own form of expertise. In the storage bay, Warrant Officer Odessa was already in the catapult's cockpit before the alert's second tone finished sounding, the neurohelmet sealing around his head, the reactor spinning up from idle to combat output in a sequence that took 11 seconds and produced a rising harmonic that resonated through Destiny's ancient hull in a way that felt, improbably, like the ship recognizing something. Young's voice came through the calm. Odessa, the mech stays in the bay. This is not a deployment situation. Understood, Colonel. A pause. Reactor at combat output. If you need the power draw for shields or propulsion, I can route it through the junction Lieutenant Scott identified this morning. Warrant Officer Adissa standing by. Young looked at Scott. Scott looked at the power routing display. It would work, Scott said, with the cautious tone of someone who meant it might work but understood the moment required something slightly more committed. Do it, Young said. The catapult's reactor output flowed into Destiny's power grid like water finding a channel it had been waiting for, and the ship's shield efficiency climbed 7% in under a minute. Not enough to change the fundamental calculus of 3 Nakai vessels against one ancient ship, but enough to matter. In the storage bay, Adissa sat in his cockpit in the dark and watched his power output readings and waited, which was what MechWarriors did between the moments that defined them. The Nakai fired first. The first Nakai salvo hit Destiny's port quarter and the ship rang like a struck bell, ancient hull absorbing and distributing impact energy through structural pathways that were millions of years old and still, and probably, better at their job than anything humanity had subsequently engineered. In the storage bay, the catapult swayed on its feet, the gyroscopic stabilizers and its leg actuators compensating automatically. And Adissa's hands moved across his weapons console with the muscle memory of 10,000 simulator hours and 4 actual combat deployments. His missile racks were empty. His large lasers were live. He sat in the dark and waited because those were his orders. 3 decks up, Destiny's control interface room had become the specific organized chaos that Young had learned to function inside. Multiple conversations running simultaneously. Damage reports layering over tactical displays, Scott's voice from the weapon controls and Brody's from engineering and Park's from sensors all feeding into a picture that was bad but not yet catastrophic. Second salvo incoming, Brody called. They're targeting the drive section. Evasive, Young said. Destiny doesn't exactly. Eli started. I know. Do what we can. The ship lurched as Franklin coaxed whatever maneuvering response Destiny's ancient systems would permit, which was less a tactical evasion and more a dignified flinch. The second salvo clipped the drive section's outer plating and the power grid flickered, recovered, flickered again before stabilizing at 83% of the catapult augmented level they'd achieved 7 minutes ago. Shields at 61%, Park reported. Hull breach in section 47. Emergency bulkhead sealed. Rourke appeared in the control room doorway, which she'd evidently reached at speed from the crew quarters. She assessed the tactical display in approximately 2 seconds. 3 vessels. They're maintaining distance and firing in sequence, rotating their attack vectors. Her voice had the quality of someone describing something they recognized. They're not trying to destroy you. They're hurting. Young looked at her. Hurting toward what? That's what I'd want to know before the third salvo. The third salvo didn't come from the Nakai. On Destiny's hull, in the shadow of the port drive housing where the ship's surface was pitted and dark, something moved. Okafor saw it first on the secondary sensor feed she'd pulled to the tablet Young had authorized her to carry. A heat bloom, organic in signature, 3 separate contact points appearing simultaneously against the ancient metal. Boarding craft, she said. They attached during the second salvo. The attack was cover. Young was already on the comm. All teams, we have boarders, port drive section, 3 entry points. Scott, take Alpha team. Colonel. Okafor's voice was controlled and precise. How many personnel do you have available for corridor defense? Young ran the mental count. Stripped against essential stations. 14. Maybe 18 if I pull from engineering. Against how many boarders, historically? Last time 30. Could be more. Okafor looked at him steadily. I have 40 conventional infantry aboard the Iron Heart who have been sitting with nothing to do since we arrived. And I have Adissa and a BattleMech in your storage bay. A pause. Your corridors are too narrow for the catapult. But my infantry are not. Young held the look for 1 second. 2. The calculation was not complicated and they both knew it. Authorization granted, he said. Your infantry, your command coordinated with Scott. Adissa holds position. Okafor was already moving, speaking rapidly into her own calm in the evolved English that Eli was only now getting fast enough to track in real time. 40 Irons hard infantry in AFS combat suits, lighter than BattleMech armor but significantly better than Destiny crew's standard gear, began moving through the ship toward the breach points with a disciplined speed that made Young's people look, by comparison, like they were still learning what urgency felt like. The Nakai boarders came through the hull in the way they always came. Fast, overwhelming in the first seconds, confident in the disorienting effect of their stunner weapons on human nervous systems. What they found in Destiny's port drive corridors was different from every previous boarding action. Iron's hard infantry held the first junction in a textbook crossfire arrangement, AFS training doctrine executed in ancient corridors with a precision that the Nakai's tactical models apparently hadn't accounted for. The stunner fire that would have dropped Destiny's crew in the open corridor instead hit corner cover and bulkhead angles while suppressing fire from 3 directions forced the boarding party into exactly the geometry Rourke's sergeant had established 20 seconds before first contact. Eli, monitoring from the control room, watched the engagement feed with his heart doing something uncomfortable and complicated. That's working. Yes, said Rourke, beside him, with the quiet satisfaction of a commander watching training become outcome. It lasted 4 minutes. The Nakai boarding party, 22 individuals, was repelled completely, 11 captured, 11 retreated to their hull attachment points and detached. Iron's hard infantry casualties, 3 stunned, none dead. Destiny crew casualties from the boarding. 0, because Destiny's crew had been kept at their essential stations rather than thrown into corridor fighting. They were less equipped to win. Young stood in the control room and processed this. Outside, the 3 Nakai vessels had stopped their attack pattern the moment the boarding craft detached, exactly as Rourke had predicted. Exactly the herding behavior interrupted by an outcome their tactical model hadn't included. They held position for 90 seconds, which on a Nakai vessel was apparently the equivalent of a very rapid strategic reassessment, then folded away into the dark. The silence they left behind had a different quality than previous post-engagement silences aboard Destiny. Fuller somehow. Less hollow. Young found Rourke at his elbow. Your people did good work, he said. They always do, she said. Then, because she was Rourke, we'll need to debrief the captured Nakai. Whatever intelligence we can extract about their tactical models is worth more than any other outcome from this engagement. Agreed. Young paused. You have experience with prisoner interrogation? 30 years of it. She looked at him steadily. The question is whether you trust me to conduct it. Young considered the 40 infantry who had just defended his ship better than his own people could have managed, the Catapult S reactor still feeding clean power into Destiny's grid, the Nakai retreating from an engagement they'd calculated as favorable. Yeah, he said. I do. Rush found Okafor in the unlock section 3 days after the boarding action. She was alone, which he'd anticipated. Snow Ravens, he'd learned from Eli's cultural briefings, valued solitary analysis the way other clans valued communal combat. She stood before the ancient archive terminal that he'd spent 4 months unable to activate, reading the characters on its dormant screen with the focused attention of someone who didn't understand the language but understood the architecture of information systems well enough to map the logic underneath the symbols. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment before she spoke. Dr. Rush, she said without turning. You have been standing there for 40 seconds. I wanted to see what you do with it unsupervised. And? You didn't touch it. Most people touch things they don't understand. You mapped it first. He moved into the room. That's Snow Raven doctrine, yes? Assess before committing. She turned then, her expression revealing precisely nothing. You have been studying us. I study everything aboard this ship. It's essentially my function. He stopped at a respectful distance. Close enough for conversation, far enough to communicate that he understood boundaries existed even when he chose to test them. I owe you an apology. My approach to your reactor systems was poorly judged. It was deliberately judged, she corrected. You wanted a reaction. You got one. Now you know how we respond to unauthorized reaches for our assets. A pause. What do you actually want, Dr. Rush? Rush looked at the archive terminal. In the low light of the unlocked section, the ancient characters on its surface seemed less dormant than waiting, the specific patience of a system that had been running its own internal processes for millions of years and had simply stopped displaying them. That terminal has been inactive since we found this room. I've tried every access protocol in Destiny's database. Every ancient command sequence I've been able to reconstruct. He paused. It activated for 30 seconds yesterday, while your engineers were running a diagnostic on the Iron's Hard S reactor. Okafor looked at the terminal. Back at Rush. You believe our fusion signature triggered it. I believe the siege ship beacon that brought you here was calibrated to your reactor output. And I believe this terminal is part of the same system. He met her eyes directly, which he didn't always bother to do. I am not asking for your reactors. I am asking whether you'd be willing to run a controlled diagnostic sequence in this room, in this specific location, with me present, and see what happens. The silence lasted long enough to be genuine consideration rather than theater. With Colonel Young's authorization, she said finally. Of course, Rush said in the tone of someone for whom of course was doing significant heavy lifting. Young authorized it, which surprised Rush slightly and shouldn't have. Young's tactical instincts had sharpened considerably since the boarding action, and he'd correctly identified the archive as a potential asset worth the controlled risk of investigation. He attended in person, which surprised Rush not at all. Rourke came too, standing at Young's shoulder with her arms folded and the expression of someone who had decided to trust the process while reserving judgment on the people running it. Adissa brought a portable power coupling from the catapult. A piece of inner sphere engineering that looked aggressively out of place against Destiny's ancient surfaces, and at Okafor's direction ran a low-output diagnostic cycle, the reactor breathing at approximately 15% capacity through the coupling and into the room's power substrate. The terminal woke up. Not dramatically, no cascade of light, no ancient fanfare. It simply became present, the way a person became present when they stopped pretending to be asleep. Characters resolved on the screen in sequences that Rush photographed continuously, his tablet barely keeping pace with the display rate. Can you read it? Young asked. Some of it. Enough. Rush's voice had gone quiet in the way it went quiet when he was genuinely absorbed rather than performing absorption. It's a navigation archive. Star charts for a region of space approximately. He paused, calculating. 4 billion light-years from our current position. Our current position, Colonel. Which means whoever charted this was operating at a range that makes Destiny's mission look. He stopped. Look what? Young said. Local, Rush said. The terminal continued displaying for 6 minutes and 40 seconds, then returned to dormancy as the diagnostic cycle completed. In the silence afterward, the room felt different. The specific density of a space where something important had happened and everyone present knew it, and nobody was ready to say it aloud yet. Rourke spoke first, practically. What does it mean operationally? It means Destiny has a destination more specific than we understood, Rush said. And it means the beacon that brought your ship here was placed by something that knew, millions of years ago, that a vessel with your reactor signature would eventually need to find it. Something, Young said carefully. Not the Ancients? The Ancients built Destiny. The Ancients built the Gate Network. Rush looked at the dormant terminal. I don't believe the Ancients built whatever left this archive. The mathematical notation is different. Older. He paused. Significantly older. The weight of that settled over the room unevenly. Rush absorbing it with something that looked almost like satisfaction. Young with the steady concern of a commander receiving information that expanded his problem without clarifying it, Rourke with the pragmatic stillness of someone filing a fact for future use. Okafor stood before the terminal for a long moment after the others had begun moving toward the door. Eli, hanging back near the entrance, watched her reach out and place one hand flat against the dormant screen, not activating it, not trying to, simply making contact with something impossibly old in the way that humans sometimes needed to make contact with things that dwarfed them. She stood like that for 3 seconds. Then she withdrew her hand and followed the others out. Eli fell into step beside her. "You okay?" She considered the question with more seriousness than he'd expected. "In Snow Raven training," she said, "they teach us that the most dangerous moment in any engagement is not when the enemy is strongest. It is when you realize the engagement is larger than you initially mapped." Eli thought about that. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Welcome to Destiny." The trial of grievance began, as most crises aboard Destiny began, with something small. MechWarriors second-class Daven Corys, Snow Raven, 23 years old, the youngest warrior aboard the Ironheart, had been assigned to a joint work detail with Destiny's crew, clearing debris from a section of corridor that the Nakai boarding action had structurally compromised. The work was unglamorous and physical and exactly the kind of labor that revealed character, which was probably why Sergeant Reed had assigned his most difficult personality, Specialist Greer adjacent in temperament if not in rank, to the same detail. The argument started over a tool. Specifically over who had set down a cutting implement in a location that blocked a specific workflow, and whose responsibility it was to move it. In the inner sphere this would have been resolved through profanity and eventual silence. In Clan Snow Raven it was resolved differently. Corys formally invoked a trial of grievance. By the time Young heard about it, the challenge had already been accepted. Destiny's Corporal Thanis, 26, former collegiate wrestler, had apparently decided that whatever the formal words meant, the underlying meaning was clear enough and his answer was yes. The gathered audience of both crews in the corridor had constituted, under clan law as Okafor grimly explained it to Young, sufficient witness to make the acceptance binding. "Tell me you can stop it," Young said. "I can stop it," Okafor said. "But stopping it unilaterally, without a recognized counter-mechanism, violates the standing of every Snow Raven warrior aboard this ship. They will comply with my order, and they will lose something they cannot recover." She paused. "Clan honor is not decoration, Colonel. It is load-bearing. So is my crew's cohesion." "I know." She met his eyes steadily. "Which is why I am proposing we let it proceed under controlled conditions, with an agreed framework, and use the outcome to establish something both crews need. Which is a visible, legitimate method for resolving conflict between our people that neither side can dismiss as imposed by the other's command structure." Young was quiet for a moment. Rourke, standing to his left, said nothing, which was her version of agreement. "Controlled conditions," Young said. "You defined those. First blood or submission. No weapons. Witnessed by both full crews. Outcome is binding for the specific grievance only, not precedent for command authority, not leverage for resource negotiation, not anything except what it is." She paused. "And both participants understand this beforehand, explicitly, or it does not proceed." Young looked at her for a long moment. "You've done this before. Managed it into something functional." "I have managed clan warriors and inner sphere soldiers in the same unit for 4 years," she said. "You learn which hills to hold and which to route around." They held it in the storage bay, with the catapult standing dormant at the far end like an unlikely referee. Both crews arranged themselves along the walls with the self-sorting instinct of people who understood they were watching something that mattered. BattleTech personnel on one side, Destiny crew on the other, with a middle ground that was slowly, uncertainly, beginning to populate with people who didn't feel the need to choose a wall. Eli stood in the middle ground. Rourke, after a moment's consideration, joined him there, which Eli noted as significant. The fight lasted 4 minutes and was, objectively, excellent. Corey's was fast and technically precise. Snow Raven unarmed combat doctrine emphasizing efficiency and joint control in the way of someone who understood that a MechWarrior's hands were simultaneously their most important asset and their most vulnerable one outside a cockpit. Thawne's was stronger and absorbed the early exchanges with the patient accumulation of someone waiting for a specific opening. He found it at the 2-minute mark, a grip transition that Corey's training hadn't fully mapped, and for 30 seconds it genuinely could have gone either way. Then Corey's adapted, which was the moment Eli decided he understood Snow Raven slightly better than he had before. Not the adaptation itself but the speed of it, the absence of panic during the moment of disadvantage, the way the young warrior processed being wrong about something mid-execution and immediately became right about something else. Thawne submitted at 4 minutes and 7 seconds, a clean tap against the deck that Corey's released instantly, stepping back with the precise distance of someone who understood that the moment of release was as important as the moment of victory. The silence afterward was the specific silence of two groups of people recalibrating simultaneously. Corey's crossed to Thawne's and extended a hand, not the inner sphere handshake but the clan warrior's grip, forearm to forearm, which Thawne's matched after a 1-second delay that suggested instinct rather than instruction. The sound that came from the BattleTech side of the room was not quite applause and not quite acknowledgement, but something between them. The sound from Destiny's crew was quieter and took slightly longer to arrive, but it arrived. Young found Okafor at his shoulder. "That went better than it should have," he said quietly. "It went exactly as well as the preparation deserved," she said. "No better." What nobody had anticipated was Greer. Master Sergeant Ronald Greer had watched the trial from his position near the bay entrance with the expression he wore when processing something that resonated with a part of himself he didn't often discuss. After the crews had begun dispersing, he crossed the bay floor to where Corey's was wrapping a minor abrasion on his forearm, and stood before the young clansman with his arms at his sides in the specific posture of someone who was not issuing a challenge and wanted that to be absolutely clear. "Good fight," Greer said. Corey's looked up. "Af," he said, the clan affirmative that Eli had explained was somewhere between yes and acknowledged, and I respect the context in which this is being said. Then, after a moment, "You would have submitted earlier." Greer's eyebrow rose. "That's so. Your stance during the opening. You have the training. You would have recognized the grip transition before Thawne's did." A pause. "Why did you not compete?" Greer was quiet for a moment. "Not my grievance," he said. Corey's absorbed this. Nodded slowly, with the seriousness of someone adding a data point to a model they were actively refining. "In Snow Raven," he said, "we say the warrior who chooses when to fight understands war better than the warrior who fights whenever offered." Greer looked at him for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "We say something like that too." It was the beginning of something, Eli thought, watching from across the bay. Small and load-bearing, like most beginnings that mattered. The planet appeared on Destiny's sensors 6 days later like an answer to a question the ship had been holding quietly. M-class, atmospheric composition within survivable parameters, significant surface water. Biomass readings that the sensors translated as extensive in the cautious language of ancient automated systems that had been making these assessments for millions of years and had learned not to promise more than the data supported. It was also, inconveniently, occupied. Not by a civilization, the sensor sweep showed no structured settlements, no electromagnetic emissions, no evidence of organized technology. But the biomass readings included large, mobile concentrations moving in patterns that Brody's analysis eventually characterized as migratory herding behavior, which meant fauna, which meant an ecosystem complex enough to have developed it, which meant the food question had a potential answer that required ground assessment before anyone started celebrating. Young authorized a combined survey team. 4 Destiny crew, 4 Iron's Heart infantry, 1 scientific observer from each side. Rourke insisted on leading the Iron's Heart contingent personally, which Young didn't argue with. He'd learned which of Rourke's decisions were negotiable, and which were simply the shape of how she operated. Eli went as the scientific observer from Destiny's side, which he suspected Young had arranged deliberately, the same way Young arranged most things that required someone to function as a human bridge between two groups who were still learning each other's grammar. The planet's surface was cold and amber-colored, the vegetation a deep ochre that caught the system's slightly cooler star and turned it into something that looked almost like permanent late afternoon. The survey team moved through it in the paired formation that had evolved naturally over 6 days of joint operations. Destiny crew and Iron's Hard infantry alternating positions, a pattern nobody had formally ordered but that had emerged from the simple logic of distributed competence. The fauna were large. Eli's first look at them, cresting a low ridge 40 minutes into the survey, produced a sound he would later describe as a controlled exclamation and Rourke would later describe as a yelp. They were herd animals in the way that certain things were herd animals, massive, slow-moving, operating in groups of 30 to 50, with a biomass per individual that the scanner translated into nutritional figures that made the food calculation aboard Destiny shift dramatically toward the survivable end of the spectrum. Edible? Rourke asked, scanner in hand. Biochemistry is compatible, said Dr. Volker, from behind Eli. Protein structures, fat composition, with basic preparation, yes. Substantially, yes. Rourke lowered the scanner, looked at the herd moving slowly across the amber plain below the ridge. Looked at Eli. How many does Destiny need to meaningfully extend our combined food window? Eli did the math he'd been doing in his head since the scanner readings came in. 20. Maybe 25. Rourke nodded, the nod of someone for whom the next step was self-evident and logistically straightforward. My infantry can manage a coordinated hunt. We have the training and the equipment. There's a problem, Eli said. Rourke looked at him with the expression of someone who had learned that when Eli said there's a problem it was worth listening to, which had taken approximately 4 days to establish, and which Eli considered one of his better recent achievements. The sensor readings also show. He pulled up the display. A second mobile concentration. Different signature. Predator scale, moving in from the northern quarter. He expanded the map. They've been tracking the herd for approximately 6 hours. They're going to hit that plane in. He checked. Roughly 40 minutes. Everyone looked at the northern ridgeline. Nothing visible yet. How large? Rourke asked. Large enough that the sensor is flagging them as a threat category. Eli paused. Which on an ancient automated system that has seen things we genuinely cannot imagine means. Large, said one of the Iron's Hard infantry, a corporal named Besta, with the flat certainty of someone completing a sentence they'd heard before. Very large, Eli confirmed. They came over the northern ridge at the 38-minute mark, which meant the ancient sensor estimate had been accurate to within 2 minutes, which under different circumstances Eli would have found impressive. There were 11 of them. Hexapodal, heavily armored in natural plating, each one approximately the mass of a main battle tank and moving with the deceptive speed of something that had evolved specifically to close distance before prey could process the threat. The herd broke immediately, the way prey herds always broke. Sudden, chaotic, every individual animal making the same calculation simultaneously and the calculation producing a stampede that redirected directly toward the ridge where the survey team was standing. Up, Rourke said, one word, and the combined team moved with a unified speed that 6 days of joint operations had made possible, scrambling for the rocky outcropping above the ridge line while 40 tons of panicked herbivore thundered through the space they'd just vacated. From the outcropping, Eli watched the predators engage the herd with the efficient horror of a natural system doing exactly what it had evolved to do. He was also, with the part of his brain that never fully stopped being a gamer, tracking the tactical geometry of 11 large predators between the survey team and their gate back to Destiny's shuttle. We have a route problem, he said. Rourke assessed the terrain. Confirmed. She keyed her comm. Iron's Hard actual, this is Rourke. We need aerial extraction from survey coordinates, priority 1. Static. Then Okafor's voice clipped. Shuttle is engaged with a minor drive issue. 20 minutes minimum. What's your situation? Rourke looked at the Predators. Looked at her infantry. Looked at Eli with the expression of someone running options and finding them limited. Then she keyed a different frequency. Odessa. What is the Catapult's current operational status? Odessa's response came immediately, the tone of a MechWarrior who had been waiting 6 days for exactly this question. Fully operational, Force Commander. Reactor hot, weapons live, ready to deploy. Can you reach survey coordinates? Shuttle drop to the planet's surface and walk from the landing zone. 40 minutes. You have 38. A pause of approximately 1 second. Understood. Deploying. Young's voice cut into the channel immediately. Rourke. Colonel, I have 11 Predators between my team and extraction and a 20-minute shuttle delay. I am requesting BattleMechs support for a non-combat survey team recovery. A pause. This is exactly the kind of situation we discussed. The silence on Young's end lasted 4 seconds. Authorized. Odessa, you have a go. Weapons free for threat neutralization only. Af, said Odessa, and the channel filled briefly with the rising harmonic of a catapult reactor climbing to combat output before cutting to static. On the outcropping, surrounded by amber vegetation and the sounds of a planetary food chain doing its work, Eli sat with his scanner and waited for the distant sound of a 20-meter bipedal war machine that had somehow become, in the course of 6 improbable days, something resembling cavalry. The catapult came down through the amber atmosphere like a verdict. Odessa had configured the shuttle drop for maximum descent speed, the Iron's hard atmospheric craft releasing the mech at 500 meters and pulling away sharply while the catapult's jump jets, designed for battlefield repositioning, not atmospheric insertion, fired in carefully sequenced bursts that slowed the descent from fatal to merely dramatic. It hit the plane 2 kilometers north of the survey team's outcropping with an impact that the ground transmitted clearly through the rock they were sitting on, a deep concussive thud that made the amber vegetation ripple outward in a perfect circle. The Predators stopped. All 11 of them, simultaneously in the specific frozen posture of apex predators encountering something their evolutionary history had not prepared them to categorize. The herd animals were already gone, scattered beyond sensor range, but the Predators remained, processing the 20-meter bipedal machine that had just dropped from the sky and was now walking toward them at 40 kilometers per hour with the patient, ground-eating stride of something that had decided where it was going and was not particularly interested in what stood between it and that destination. Odessa, Rourke said into the calm. Non-lethal if possible. Attempting, Odessa said, with the tone of someone who found the instruction reasonable but was reserving judgment on the outcome. The catapult fired its medium lasers at the ground 15 meters in front of the Predator pack, not at them, between them and the outcropping, and the superheated earth and vaporized vegetation produced a wall of light and sound and smell that the Predator's sensory systems apparently classified without ambiguity. They broke in 4 seconds, flowing around the catapult in a wide arc and disappearing north with a speed that suggested they had decided, collectively and permanently, that this particular hunting ground had changed categories. In the silence they left behind, Eli became aware that he had been gripping a rock outcropping with both hands at a tension level that had probably left marks. Non-lethal, Odessa reported. Route is clear. Back aboard Destiny, the debrief was quieter than Young had expected. The survey team filed their reports, Volker confirmed the nutritional assessment, and the logistics of a controlled hunting operation on the planet's surface were established with the practical efficiency of people who had a solvable problem and sufficient combined expertise to solve it. Iron's hard infantry would lead the hunt. Destiny crew would manage processing and storage. The food window for both crews extended, by Ray's revised calculation, to approximately 14 weeks. It was, by any measure, a good outcome. Young found Rush in the unlock section afterward, which was where Rush went when he was thinking about things he hadn't decided to share yet. The archive terminal was dormant. It only activated with the Iron's hard S reactor input, a dependency that Rush had been quietly mapping for days. He stood before it with his arms crossed and the expression of a man running the same calculation repeatedly and getting the same answer and not being sure the answer was survivable. "Tell me," Young said. Rush looked at him. The usual assessment of how much to reveal. Young had watched it often enough to recognize the moment Rush decided that honesty was more operationally useful than management. "The archive," Rush said. "I've been cross-referencing the navigation data with Destiny's existing star charts. The destination it's pointing to, the region 4 billion light-years out." He paused. "Destiny's course is already adjusted toward it. Has been, subtly, for longer than we've had access to the archive. The ship has known." Young absorbed this. "Known since when?" "Since the Iron's Heart arrived." Rush met his eyes. "Possibly since the siege ship beacon activated. Possibly longer." A pause. "The beacon wasn't a rescue protocol, Colonel. I was wrong about that. It was a signal. Something placed it here millions of years ago, and calibrated it to activate when a vessel matching Iron's Heart's profile came within range. And when it activated, it gave Destiny coordinates." He turned back to the terminal. "We were brought here deliberately. Both of us. This ship and that dropship." The weight of it settled over the room. Young let it. "By what?" he said finally. "I don't know. Something older than the ancients. Something that built a navigation archive in a notation the ancients themselves apparently borrowed from." Rush's voice was quiet in the way it went quiet when he was genuinely uncertain, which was rarer than his confident uncertainty and more honest. Something that apparently knew, millions of years ago, that humanity would develop fusion technology and eventually produce a civilization capable of the kind of warfare the Iron's Heart represents. And that new destiny would be here when it happened. Young was quiet for a long moment. "Does Okafor know?" "Not yet. She needs to." Rush looked at him with something that might have been surprise. "You're going to tell her?" "We're going to tell her," Young said. "And Rourke." "Tonight, in the unlock section, with the archive present." He held Rush's gaze steadily. "These people are stranded in our universe because something used them to send us coordinates. They have the right to know that before we go anywhere near whatever is at those coordinates." Rush was silent for a moment. "You understand that telling them changes our operational security posture significantly." "Our operational security posture," Young said, "currently consists of 2 crews who are learning to trust each other on a ship that is apparently being steered by something older than the civilization that built it." He moved toward the door. "Operational security is not our primary problem, Rush." He left Rush in the unlocked section with the dormant terminal and the ancient stars mapped on its surface and the particular silence of a man who had been outmaneuvered by straightforwardness, which happened to Rush occasionally and never quite stopped surprising him. In the corridor outside, Young keyed his calm. "Eli. Find Okafor and Rourke. Tell them I need an hour of their time tonight." A pause. "Tell them to bring whoever they trust." Eli's response came back after a moment. "How much should I tell them it's about?" Young thought about 4 billion light-years of dark space and a signal placed millions of years ago for a ship and a crew that hadn't existed yet. "Tell them," he said, "that it's about why they're here." The meeting in the unlock section happened at the end of the ship's night cycle, when Destiny's corridors were quiet and the reduced lighting gave the ancient architecture the quality of something half-remembered rather than fully present. Young had set up a portable light source near the archive terminal. Practical, unglamorous, the kind of illumination that said this is a working conversation rather than anything ceremonial. Okafor brought Rourke and Adissa. Young brought Rush and Eli. Nobody had planned for Greer to be there, but nobody was surprised when he appeared in the doorway and Young nodded him in, because Greer had a reliable instinct for moments that mattered and an equally reliable instinct for not requiring explanation when he arrived at them. Rush presented the findings without preamble, which was his version of respect, the understanding that the people in this room didn't need cushioning, they needed accuracy. The archive data. The navigational correlation with Destiny's adjusted course. The age of the notation system and what it implied. The siege ship beacon's true function, corrected from his earlier assessment. All of it, plainly, in the order that made logical sense rather than the order that managed reactions. When he finished, the silence lasted long enough to be genuine. Okafor spoke first. "You are telling us that our arrival was not an accident." "No," Rush said. "It was not. And that whatever arranged it is older than the civilization that built this ship. The mathematical evidence suggests that, yes." She was quiet for a moment. Beside her, Rourke had the expression of someone who had long ago made peace with the universe being larger and stranger than any briefing document could contain, and was simply updating her operational model accordingly. Adissa looked at the archive terminal with the focused attention of a man recalibrating something fundamental about his understanding of his own situation. "In Snow Raven Doctrine," Okafor said finally, "when an operation's parameters change significantly from the initial mission brief, the commanding officer has three options: abort, adapt, or escalate." She paused. "We cannot abort. We have no mechanism for escalation. There is no higher command structure to contact." She looked at Young directly. "Which leaves adaptation?" "That's been our operating mode since we got here," Young said. "Then we are already aligned." She looked at the terminal. 4 billion light years. Do you know how long it will take Destiny to reach those coordinates?" Rush answered carefully. "At current speed and with the course adjustment already underway, years. Possibly decades. The distance is," a pause, "significant. And you intend to go." "Destiny intends to go," Rush said, with the precision of someone who had spent months understanding the difference between the ship's intentions and the crew's. "Whether we intend it is somewhat secondary to the ship's navigation system, which has apparently been making this decision for longer than any of us have been aboard." Rourke made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "A ship with its own agenda. In the inner sphere we'd call that a critical systems fault." "In the inner sphere," Eli said. "You'd be right." The formal integration agreement was drafted by Ray and reviewed by Okafor and Rourke over 2 days, with Eli serving as the translator and occasional diplomatic buffer when the language of 3 centuries of divergent legal tradition produced clauses that meant different things to different signatories. It was not a surrender document, and not an alliance treaty, and not a crew merger protocol. It was something new, shaped by the specific strangeness of the situation it was trying to address, and its imperfection was probably its most honest quality. Iron's hard personnel formally integrated into Destiny's crew structure while retaining their own chain of command for internal Snow Raven and AFFS matters. Okafor and Rourke joined Young's senior staff with advisory authority. BattleMech assets remained under Iron's hard command but were available for joint deployment under a shared authorization protocol that required Young's operational sign-off and Okafor's tactical command. The Catapult S reactor continued supplementing Destiny's power grid at an agreed output level. The document was signed in the mess hall, which was the largest communal space aboard, with both crews present. No ceremony had been planned. Ceremony emerged anyway, the way it always did when humans marked something that mattered, a gathering quality, a collective attention, the specific silence of people understanding they were present at something they would remember. Young signed first. Then Okafor, with the precise signature of someone who had been taught that their name on a document was a commitment of self, not just identity. Then Rourke, quick and definitive. Then Ray, for the IOE record that would eventually reach Earth if the communication stones held. Eli witnessed. Greer witnessed. Adissa witnessed, which had not been planned but which Okafor approved with a nod when he stepped forward. 3 days after the signing, Eli found Okafor at Destiny's forward viewport during the quiet watch, the one he'd taken to walking during the ship's night cycle because the stars looked different at this distance from everything familiar, and he had not yet decided whether that was beautiful or simply true. She was looking at the star field with the expression he'd seen in the unlock section, the one that was not quite awe and not quite calculation but existed precisely between them. "Do you think we'll make it?" he asked. Whatever is at those coordinates. She considered the question with the seriousness she gave all genuine questions. In my experience, she said, the answer to that question is determined less by the distance than by what the crew becomes during the journey. She paused. We are two crews who should not be able to function together. Different centuries. Different galaxies. Different everything. She looked at the stars. And yet, Eli looked at the stars too. Thought about a storage bay with a catapult standing in ancient light. Thought about Greer and Corey's on either side of a line that had quietly stopped being a line. Thought about Rush and Okafor in the unlocked section, two careful minds circling the same extraordinary truth from opposite directions. And yet, he agreed. Destiny moved through the dark towards something older than the civilization that had built it, carrying two crews who were becoming, slowly and badly and with considerable friction, one. What if BattleTech entered the Stargate Universe? Asked a question that neither universe could answer alone. What happens when humanity's capacity for self-destruction becomes, in the right context, humanity's greatest survival asset? The ICS Ironheart arrived in Destiny's star system carrying weapons, honor codes, and 3 centuries of hard-won military knowledge built entirely from fighting itself. It found a crew that had been surviving on improvisation, collective willpower, and a ship that was smarter than anyone aboard it. Neither group should have worked with the other. The cultural distances were too great, the resource pressures too acute, the pride of both sides too load-bearing to bend easily. They bent anyway. Not because the situation demanded it. Survival situations demand a lot of things that people refuse to provide. They bent because the individuals involved were better than the systems that had produced them, which is the most human thing there is. Somewhere between a trial of grievance witnessed by both crews and a dormant ancient terminal waking to fusion light, between Greer and Corey's on either side of a line that stopped being a line, between Rush's calculations and Okafor's steady adaptation, something genuine formed. Not an alliance. Something harder to name and more durable. Destiny carries it forward now, toward coordinates placed millions of years ago by something that apparently knew this moment was coming. Indeed. Hit the subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you for watching.